Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture for Monday, November 9th. And so this is the start of week 11, which means we are talking about Monopoly. So before we get started, a few things I want to kind of go over here real quick, just about what's coming up here in the near future. First of which is the 11th quiz is due on Friday, which is the 13th, not coincidentally. So quiz 11 due on the 13th. We have a total of 15 weeks of material. So that means after this week, there are 4 weeks left of material to cover. Now, what complicates things is with Thanksgiving coming up here in what we're looking at 2 weeks, give or take. Yes, so 2 weeks from now. So next week is a full week. Then we got the Thanksgiving break. Then we got another full week after that. And continue into December. And so with Thanksgiving week being there, I am combining weeks 13 and 14 together. So that being said, it would be much like it was with the elasticity topic, where I kind of blended that with the next topic, which was market failure, and I kind of combined them and had two quizzes due on one day. We're going to do the same thing, largely because I simply just don't think it's the right thing to do to have something due the Friday after Thanksgiving. So to kind of stick with our theme of having things due on Friday, just to be consistent, we'll push it back and make it due on the 4th of December, which is the Friday, not immediately after Thanksgiving, but the one after that. So gives you plenty of leeway to work with any of the things, in terms of getting the material done. Whether you want to use the Thanksgiving weekend, and that's fine if you're so inclined. If you'd rather just take a few days and forget about class altogether, I'm okay with that too. And so it's entirely up to you how you choose to do so. So just kind of want to let you know that that's coming up here. And so this week and next week will be normal. And then obviously with the Thanksgiving week, with the abbreviated holiday and everything going on there, I won't be posting any lectures for the most part. I might put one out the Monday of Thanksgiving week. And then what I'll probably do is just either record them and post them over the break, and you can listen to them whenever you choose to, or I'll simply just wait until the following Monday, which puts us at, what's today? I guess the 30th of November to keep doing that. So I'll remind you as we get closer, but just kind of wanted to throw that out there. The fourth assignment will be due this Friday, and this is the one where you pick a business that you're familiar with, whether or not you work there, whether or not you're a customer, whether or not it's just something you know a lot about, or whether or not it's something just interests you and you wanted to kind of explore it a little bit more. And I'm asking you 12 questions. A lot of the answers are going to be kind of theoretical in nature because I understand you might not necessarily know all the details about how the business is run. And so when I'm asking you what some certain costs might be, I'm not asking you to necessarily identify them in terms of a dollar value or actually, do research to figure out what they could possibly be. I want you to kind of think through from your perspective and kind of look at analyzing what some of the costs associated with running the business is. This is not a research project. It's more or less exploring how a lot of the theory that we're covering here throughout this section of the semester, when we talk about theory of the firm, how it really does apply to the real world. And that's kind of the theme I want to stick with. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're looking at assignment 4. This morning early, I kind of went in and just see if there were any of them yet that anybody had submitted. And I think in both the sections so far, I might have 2 or 3 in each class of people that submitted them. So obviously it's not due for a few days, so clearly I didn't expect a lot of them. I was just curious. So just kind of keep that in mind that assignment's due on the 13th. Assignment 5 is available. It's due on the 4th, which is, yes, it's still pretty far away, but just, know that it's out there and you can work on it as you choose to. Same thing with the application paper, which is due on the 7th. Learn Smart exercises due the very last day of the semester. I mean, last day is that's the even for final, that would be the end there. So that's the 18th of December. Keep in mind, those are the ones through the McGraw-Hill website, the Connect, where you need the access to it. And also keep in mind that they are broken into 16 individual units for a total of 100 points each. So that works out to be a little more than 6 points on average per unit. Keep that in mind because in the terms of the overall grade, why ideally I would love to see everybody do every single Learn Smart assignment. Keep in mind the cost versus benefits. At some point you might realize, is it necessarily worth me finishing the last 3 Learn Smart assignments to get an additional 18 points on my grade out of 1,000? So perspective matters here. And so just kind of throwing that out there. I think it's more important to really think about how you apply the economic thought process necessarily as opposed to, simply just going through and doing the Learn Smart exercises because they're there. So I'll leave it at that. Also, we have the third midterm, which I'm probably going to wrap it up today and finish it. I will make it available to you next Friday. This 13th, it'll be due on the 20th, which is the Friday before Thanksgiving. And so I put together some guidelines for that. You'll be seeing those here in the next few days as well. And so working through those questions, multiple choice questions, covering the material, I believe in weeks up through the 9th week. I think, yeah, I cut it off at perfect competition. So anyway, expect to see that coming up here as well. Um, Last point I want to make about the quizzes. Remember, I keep the top 10. So right now, if you have 10 perfect scorers on the quizzes, you cannot get any more points on quizzes, period. The max you can get is 100 points. So just kind of throwing that out there. So remember, I don't grade every single one of them. So if you miss one, it's not the end of the world because you can make it up. I'm only keeping the top 10. So that's worth putting out there as well. All right, on to the material. So the game Monopoly, if you've ever played it, and it's a common game, it's been around for, I think, about 85 years now. It was actually, the rumor has it, there was a gentleman who lived in Atlantic City, New Jersey, who was inventing the game, just something to do, something to play with his family and friends. And he used the names of the streets in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and decided, well, this would be a property owning game. And the next thing you know, some of these, one of the major game companies actually bought the rights from it, and it's history. You know, the game is worldwide. They've changed the names of the properties. You've got different versions of it for different parts of the world. Relatively popular game, even though it's a board game, which in this day and age, you know, a lot of people play video games as opposed to board games, but there's video versions of it. But it's a very common theme to use the Monopoly idea. And Monopoly, by definition, means what? One business. Mono means one. So there's basically the game objective of the game is to be the last person standing, the last player standing, and you theoretically would own all the property on the board. That's the goal. So the goal is to basically bankrupt your opponents. And so when we think about Monopoly, the graphic here on the screen has a picture of a Monopoly hotel, which is huge and oversized. It says Amazon on it relative to the rest of the board. And so basically saying Amazon is a huge player in the market. Do they necessarily have a monopoly on certain goods and services? Let's think of the pure definition of monopoly, which means one firm. Is there any other competition for Amazon out there? In a lot of different segments of markets that they're in, yes. In some areas, it could be, you could claim that they may actually have a monopoly power. So let's kind of jump into the material and talk a little bit about what monopolies are. So the official definition, a market structure in which one firm makes up the entire market, 100% market share. Now, let's say a firm actually has 95% market share. Could we conceivably say they're a monopoly? Sure, not in the purest sense of the word, but absolutely they do. They have what's called monopoly power, which means the ability to control prices in the marketplace. That's key. So historically speaking, a lot of monopolies existed in the utility industries. And so I've got the picture there of Waterworks, an electric company from the game Monopoly, which are historic examples of utilities. Obviously, you know, it takes a lot of effort to produce electricity and distribute it, and the same thing with water. And so if we look at the utility companies that we see here, even today in the 21st century, AEP generates electricity in Central Ohio. Are they the only one? No, but they have the dominant share of the market. Water company, American Water Company, basically owns a lot of different water companies across the United States. However, locally, no, they basically have control over that, distributing water out through the pipe system and delivering it to homes. Why would these companies be monopolies? Well, it turns out that it's pretty expensive to compete against them. Not that somebody wouldn't want to. And there are huge barriers to entry. We're going to talk about that here in a minute, but in some cases, it actually makes sense for there to be a monopoly. And I'll talk more about that on Wednesday when I talk about natural monopolies. So utility companies tend to be local monopolies simply because of the sheer barriers to entry and the concept of actually trying to compete. It doesn't attract competition because it's so expensive. De Beers Diamonds. There's a movie out there called Blood Diamond. And oddly enough, every time I talk about this on a lecture, I always try to make a mental note that I want to watch it one day, because I've actually had many students in previous semesters say you need to watch the movie because it talks a lot about this concept. And I agree, haven't gotten around to it yet. So I'm going to make a mental note right now and see if I can actually try to find that movie here in the next few days and watch it. But the idea of De Beers, they didn't necessarily control the diamond market on the retail side. They controlled it on the mining side, meaning they own the diamond mines. There's only certain parts of the world where diamonds occur naturally, mostly in the southern part of the African continent. Here in the United States, there's parts of actually Arkansas where there are diamond mines, but it's a really, really small segment of the overall market. So by controlling the diamond mining, De Beers essentially controlled the resource. They controlled the intermediate market, they controlled the retail market because they controlled where the diamonds actually came from. Microsoft is another example that a lot of people often refer to as a monopoly. Now, theoretically speaking, we could say that they aren't. And so when I talk about Microsoft, what am I talking about? Well, obviously software. Microsoft Windows operating system, which I'm using at this very second. Microsoft Office is another system software that they have, which I'm using at this moment as well. I'm using PowerPoint. So if I were to say, well, I'm tired of PowerPoint, I don't like Microsoft, I'm going to use the competition. Is there anything else out there? Sure, there is. I've actually considered using SlideShare before and kind of sort of playing around with it. And what really caught me was the learning curve. I know PowerPoint inside and out. Why would I want to abandon that to simply switch over to something else and have to learn it all over again, even though there might be some benefits of doing so? So the cost outweighed the benefits. And I kind of just set it aside and say, well, maybe one day I'll come back to it, but right now I'm going to stick with PowerPoint. A monopoly doesn't necessarily have to mean they have 100% of sales. Doesn't mean they have to be the only one out there. It simply means that in the case that I just talked about, when it comes down to cost versus benefits, people would gravitate toward it anyway. Which brings me to what Microsoft was actually brought to court about 20 years ago. Actually, a little bit more. I think year 2000 was when it was finally decided, where they were taken to court because of Internet Explorer, which if you are younger than me, most of you are, you probably don't even think that Internet Explorer is good anymore because it isn't. Microsoft doesn't even offer it. But for the longest time, it had a built-in advantage because what happened was anytime somebody bought a PC that had Windows pre-installed, it came with Internet Explorer, which basically said what? It gave them a built-in advantage because people didn't have an incentive to go out and find another web browser. Now, I did, and I knew plenty of people who did because I was never a fan of IE. So I could go out and get Firefox. There was a few other ones back in the day that we could use. And Chrome is another example, but the point was that for the longest time, the large majority of people used IE because it was presented to them, they were familiar with it, and they had no incentive to go someplace else. So this worked its way through the court system. And I believe Microsoft ultimately was pretty much innocent of monopoly charges, but not without spending billions of dollars and tens of thousands of man hours defending themselves in the legal system. And the same thing applied to the European Union. So to some extent, you might say, well, they weren't 100% market share, which is true, but think about the barriers to entry. So I want to use another example historically of monopolies, and that is the newspaper industry. Now, if you don't read the newspaper, believe me, you are not alone. I don't know anybody other than my parents at this point who are in their mid 70s, actually closer to 80, that are for the most part read the newspaper. And the reason they do it is solely because it's just a habit, right? Retired people, they get the newspaper every morning, they read through it over their coffee. It's what they've always done. People that are younger don't do it. I'm older than pretty much all of you, and I don't read the newspaper anymore. I used to read it every morning on my subway commute when I worked in New York City. Same thing, I worked in Boston and took the train into the city. I buy a copy of the newspaper on the way to the train in the morning, read it, and on the way back from work that next day, if I still had stuff to read, I'd read more of it. And everybody else was doing it. It was like if you're on public transportation today, you see everybody staring at their phones. 25 years ago, 20 years ago, you had people basically with newspapers in their face. So newspapers were a very important source of information for a long, long time until recently, relatively recently. So let's use the local example of the newspaper, the Columbus Dispatch. Now, like any other city in the United States, years ago, there used to be multiple newspapers, competing newspapers. I grew up in Cincinnati, and when I was a kid, we had two of them. One was the morning paper, one was the afternoon paper. And so people had a preference. They'd rather get their newspaper in the afternoon to read when they got home from work, or maybe they'd rather get it in the morning. Doesn't make a difference. There were two of them. Then they became one. Now, for all intent and purposes, newspapers are kind of extinct. So imagine for a minute that you did own the Columbus Dispatch. You had sole ownership. The company was yours. And you could charge whatever you wanted for that newspaper. How much do you charge? So think, realistically speaking, you could give it away. You could charge a penny for a copy of that physical newspaper. You could charge $100 for the copy of that newspaper. You have no competition, so it's not like they're going to force you to keep your price down. What holds you back from charging the highest possible price? Well, even though you're a monopoly, you still have to deal with the market. And guess what the demand curve for newspapers looks like in the year 2020? It's pretty far inward, right? There's not a whole lot of demand. And so what you need to do is reconcile as an individual business owner, what price do I charge to maximize my profits, yet still realizing that the market determines necessarily how many of these things are going to be sold. So the funny thing is, I'm talking about this right now. I don't even know what a copy of a physical newspaper cost in November 2020. I have no idea. Now, a Sunday paper might be $3 or $4, usually because they're more detailed and lengthy. Historically speaking, they used to have a bunch of coupons and ads and stuff like that and extra bonuses. So people would be willing to pay more for the Sunday paper. Monday through Saturday, it was just a shorter edition, and it pretty much just was the basic newspaper, and you pay less for it. And so maybe it's $1. I don't know. Maybe it's $1.25. I know I've been to public events before where the Columbus Dispatch had a little booth set up trying to get people to subscribe to it, and nobody would do it. They'd walk right by. And the reason is because they don't need to. What am I getting from a newspaper like the Columbus Dispatch that I can't get someplace else? Pretty much nothing. And so we see a lot of these news organizations are switching to web-based products or apps where you can simply access the same information on your phone. The newspaper itself is dead. So the reason I'm using this example is because even though you're a monopoly, and you might conceivably think, I can charge whatever I want for these products, the market still determines necessarily how much you can charge. And so a newspaper is a good example of something where once upon a time, if you had a monopoly, you could be a very, very wealthy person. Organizations that controlled the news, whether they owned multiple newspapers or multiple TV stations or whatever, had a lot of power. And the reason was because they controlled the product. And as a result, they could charge a lot for it. Well, what happens when there's competition that's introduced? That tends to change. So much like we get characteristics of perfectly competitive markets, we'll talk about the characteristics of a monopoly. So mono, one seller. Pure monopoly is one seller. Monopoly power doesn't necessarily mean that one seller. It just means there's one firm that has dominant share of the market. So theoretically, a company could be out there. It depends on how the market's organized. And we'll talk more about this here later in the week when I talk about how markets are concentrated. We look at something called the HHI, or Hirschman-Herfindahl Index, and it measures necessarily monopoly power. So what if you have one company out there that has 90% of the market, and you have 20 companies that split up the remaining 10? Well, for all intent and purposes, they're pretty much a monopoly, but pure monopoly, one firm. Number two, there are no close substitutes for the good. So this kind of ruins our example of the newspaper, doesn't it? Because, well, there's plenty of close substitutes for newspapers. You just get your news digitally. You get it some other format. You don't have to have a physical copy of it in front of you. But we're assuming there's no close substitutes for one key reason. What's that reason? It prevents competition. So if you have control over one thing and there's no close substitute for it, it gives you that monopoly power. The big one here is 3, barriers to entry. Things that prevent competition from even starting to begin with. And there's 3 things we can look at here. Legal restrictions. So in many industries, and I'm going to use pharmaceuticals as an example here. So there are patents regarding certain pharmaceutical products. So you'll have these drug companies, let's say, Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, a few others. They'll go out there and they'll research and spend millions, if not billions of dollars trying to come up with a cure for something or a drug that solves a problem. What's their incentive to do that if once they come up with that, everybody else can build off of their knowledge and go out and make money from the product? And so that's why we grant patents for certain things. Now, patents tend to have an expiration date, as do certain trademarks. But the idea would be a legal restriction grants you a monopoly in that area. So if you patent a product, it gives you the right, the sole right, to own and sell and distribute that product for a certain period of time. So legal restrictions. Economies of scale. These are natural monopolies. This is where it makes sense for the utility company to be the only player in town. And I'm going to talk more about this on Wednesday, but kind of shed some light on this concept here for a minute. Imagine that I got bad service from American Electric Power. So let's say they accidentally screwed up my bill and they overcharged me for electricity. And let's say that my power went out and it took them 2 days to get it back on. And let's say that my meter actually got screwed up. And I'm using this as an example because that actually happened to me earlier this year. They came out and put a new meter in, and next thing you know, our power would occasionally just go out. And I'm like, this isn't right. And it took me a while to get somebody out that knew how to fix the problem. I wasn't happy about it, but eventually the problem got fixed. Now, what if I had said from that example, you know what, AEP, I'm done with you. I'm so mad at you. I'm going to start my own company. I'm going to compete against you. They'd laugh at me. And the reason is because let's think about what it would take. I'd have to go out and find a place to build a power plant. I'd have to build a power plant. I'd have to generate the electricity. I'd have to hire all the people. I'd have to figure out a way to distribute the electricity to the public. By the time I did all that, there's no way I could charge for electricity what AEP does and make any money. And we know that. And so there's a reason why there's only one firm out there instead of 10 or 20 different firms. So I'll talk more about that on Wednesday, but that's what a national monopoly is, where it actually makes sense for there to be one firm. And then number 3 is control of essential resources. This was the De Beers Diamond example. If they control the mines, they control the market. If you control the flow of information or the flow of a product, you can control the market, and it prevents others from getting in. Number 4, we're assuming there's many buyers. So if there's only one buyer, it's something called a monopsony, which I'll talk about in a later class also. But the idea is there's lots of people buying the product and there's only one seller. And instead of being price takers, the firm here is a price searcher. They go out and look for the price that's going to give them the most profit. Now, monopolies change over time. 200 years ago, if you were the only candle maker in town, you would have had a good business. And the reason is because people needed candles for light. Today, candles are a novelty. Sure, it's nice to light a candle every now and then, but do we need it to read by? Do we need it to cook with? No, we don't. We have electricity for that. And so certain products eventually over time fade away due to technological changes. So telecommunications is a great example of something that's happened recently. And I say recently, I'm saying relatively recently, not necessarily within the last 2 or 3 years, but more like the last 30 or 40, where we've seen rampant changes take place. And so I use this as an example partially because there's a personal side to this. And so growing up, my dad worked for AT&T for 30 years. So that was the company that basically, put food on the table for us. And AT&T went to court back in the early 1980s for having monopoly control over what was called long distance telecommunication. Meaning what? That if you wanted to make a call from one city to the next, you had to use AT&T's services, their lines, all their infrastructure. Now, this was back in the day of landlines and no cell phones. Today, making a long distance call is not even something that most people are even familiar with because all you're doing is making a call. So modern day telecommunications, you don't necessarily worry about how far away the person you're calling is. For the most part, it's the same as a local call, but it wasn't always that way. And so AT&T wound up getting broken up by the legal system, by the courts, back in 1984, and they broke them into separate companies because they said they had too much power. And that revolutionized the telecommunication industry. Because what happened was it opened up the market to all kinds of different changes in technology. And so these changes in technology have completely broken down the system. You didn't have one company that controlled the market simply because they owned the infrastructure. Now, all of a sudden, with cellular communications, you've got dozens of companies out there conceivably that have a share of the market. So often technology is the thing that changes the world and with regard to market share, because what it does, it makes it easier to get into the business. Right now, today, I could start a YouTube channel and say, you know what, I'm going to create my own content out there because I don't like the way the news is doing it, or I don't like the way that certain organizations are presenting something, and I think there's a better way of doing it. And I could gain a following. Why? Because I have the door open to enter that market. I have the same access to a platform that millions of other people do. And the competition of ideas is out there. So conceivably, I could start my own news organization and say, I'm going to publish a daily video that talks about what's going on in the world with my viewpoint on it. I don't have to worry about building a printing press and distributing newspapers across the city. I don't have to worry about building a TV studio and sending the signal out to televisions. I can simply do that using the internet as a platform. Technology makes a huge difference. It tends to do what? It tends to erode a lot of those barriers to entry, which tends to do also create more competition. So I'm going to go through a graphical example of monopoly here for the remainder of the example and talk about a hypothetical about how this would work. So De Beers, for the most part, even though they've kind of lost their market share, they were pretty much considered to have a 100% grip on that diamond mining market back in the 20th century. And so I want to use diamonds as an example here. And I want to make a very, very hypothetical circumstance here solely because I just want to kind of build the model. So we're going to assume that all diamonds are exactly alike, which we know they're not, right? You get the 4 C's. What is it? Clarity, color, carat, and I actually are cut. So yeah, 4 C's of diamonds, right? So we know no 2 diamonds are exactly alike, but let's assume for a minute that they are. And we get a diamond mine that's set up, and we have a diamond miner who looks at a demand schedule that you see here on the right-hand side. So demand schedule, as we were accustomed to seeing, was the first 2 columns on the left, right? So back when we talked about demand curves, we said, well, quantity demanded, price, and notice how there was a inverse relationship between the two. The price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So let's say we have a very, very simple demand schedule here where if the price is $700 for a diamond, there's only one demanded. And let's say theoretically, if the price goes down to zero, there's a limit to the market and there's only 8 demanded, right? Now we know that's not realistic, but stick with me here. Now, what we want to think about here is necessarily revenue, specifically marginal revenue. But how do we get there? Well, first we start with total revenue. Total revenue is nothing more than Q times P. So 1 times 700 is 700, 2 times 600 is 1,200. And so if we do this for all 8 lines, notice what happens in that third column. Our total revenue starts out low. It peaks at 4 diamonds, and then it starts to drop again, and eventually drops to 0. Marginal revenue is nothing more than how much total revenue changes. And you'll notice something here as well. Starts out high, continues to get lower, eventually becomes negative. At 5 diamonds, now it's a negative 100. And obviously at 8 diamonds, it's going to be substantially negative. So if I'm the diamond miner, what's my incentive to maximize profits? In order to do so, I want to make sure that I'm bringing in more money than it costs me. Is there any incentive for a diamond miner to sell 8 diamonds and charge nothing for them? No, there isn't. Absolutely none. And the reason is because they're essentially giving away money. They'd be paying somebody to take the diamond off their hands, which makes 0 sense. The same thing with 7 diamonds or 6 diamonds or even 5 diamonds. The most they'd ever want to produce is 4. Clearly because they still have a positive marginal revenue from that. Once they produce that 5th diamond, they're actually losing money. It makes 0 sense. So if this is our demand curve for a diamond market, that's our marginal revenue curve. Now, I did this on purpose. I used an example where every time the price dropped by $100, the quantity demanded went up, so I could have a straight line. It's a little trickier with a curved line, but the straight line will illustrate the principle pretty clearly. We'll notice 2 things here. So the blue demand curve and the red marginal revenue curve start at the same place up here, right there on the vertical axis, both at 700. What happens is they both are downward sloping. Yet, and I'm not going to prove how this works, but just take my word for it at this point, the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep as the demand curve. And so what happens is the marginal revenue curve right here where the red line crosses the bottom axis is halfway between the origin and where the demand curve intersects. Furthermore, total revenues are going to be maximized where marginal revenue equals 0. So they're bringing in the most money right here, which it would be at the point of what? In this case, 4 diamonds, right? They have no incentive to ever go beyond that. So automatically that tells us monopolies are going to restrict their production, even though conceivably they can produce enough diamonds, in theory, to make everybody happy. But what happens is it doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint. They simply can't profit from it. So the rule here for profit maximization is the same as it was for perfect competition. And it will be the same for any market structure. That in order to maximize profits, we want to produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Because that's that magic spot where we're going to make the most profit. If we produce below that level, we're leaving money on the table by not producing more. If we go above that level, we're cutting into our existing profits because now it's costing us more per unit to produce something than we're receiving for it. So once again, if they're equal, what are we doing? We're maximizing profits. Marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, and I've got these actually reversed, so I will try to correct this before I post the PowerPoint. This should be decreasing. If marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, that means the costs have gone up beyond that, and we would actually want to decrease output and vice versa. And if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, we want to keep producing. So I will correct these on there, but they're actually the opposite based upon what I'm pointing out right now. So we know that under perfect competition, demand curve was equal to the marginal revenue curve. Why? Because all firms were price takers. They had to accept the market price as a given. No single firm had the power to change it. Monopoly, total opposite. They can charge whatever they want. So they're price searchers. So let's assume for a minute that we have an industry that started out as a monopoly and there was one firm. And let's say for whatever reason, the court stepped in and said, we're going to create 100 separate firms. Everyone's equally sized. So they break up the monopoly for regulatory reasons. They say one firm is no longer there. You're now being broken into 100 equally sized firms. Instead of one firm having 100% of the market, 100 firms now each have 1% of the market. Well, If, remember, the price was equal to marginal revenue for perfectly competitive firms, if we aggregate them all together, now our marginal revenue line is going to be the blue line for the demand curve. Because remember, the marginal revenue is equal to demand for the individual firm in perfect competition. Well, collectively speaking, now it's going to be equal to the total market marginal revenue for perfectly competitive firms. And then we have the marginal revenue line here for monopoly. Now let's add a marginal cost curve. So let's say the entire industry faces the same marginal cost. Everybody in the market faces the same marginal cost curve. And it would be the same cost curve whether or not that we started out as a monopoly or we broke into 100 different individually sized firms. Notice what happens here. Under monopoly, we were operating at PM, price of my monopoly at QM. And that happened to be, and I know my lines aren't perfect here, but right where the marginal revenue and marginal cost curves intersected. So a monopoly was producing less and charging more. If we move our way out to perfect competition, it lowers the price, increases the output. So think about why that happens. So the court steps in and says the monopoly is no more. It's now broken into 100 individually equally sized companies. What's going to happen? Well, they're all now competing against one another. They're all price takers now instead of price searchers. So they charge whatever the market price is, and they're in a race to lower the price. And the reason was because they want to gain that market share, right? So initially, we're going to see a huge drop in price. We're also going to see a huge increase in output because now there's 100 firms out there that are trying to gain traction in that market. They want to produce more, and because they're trying to basically gain that advantage. Plus, they also figure, well, there's economies of scale associated with doing so, right? The bigger they get, the lower their cost per unit is, the more they're going to make. The monopoly, if they didn't have economies of scale already, doesn't have the same incentive because perhaps it doesn't make sense. They can charge whatever price they want to maximize profits under the certain circumstances. Assuming the demand curve doesn't change for the product, do they really have an incentive? Maybe, maybe not. But the point I want to illustrate here is that both of these concepts, that higher prices of monopoly and lower output monopoly, do what? They reduce consumer surplus. They make consumers worse off. Under the monopoly, look at what happens. Our consumer surplus was this triangle. Remember, it's above the equilibrium price and below the demand curve. So this triangle that I'm outlining right here with the cursor, so you see it up there, is our consumer surplus under monopoly. And our monopoly profits are typically going to be represented by, well, wherever the average total cost curve would be on here. And you'd have like a rectangle that would look something like this. In perfect competition, remember, in the long run, there are no economic profits, but the consumer surplus is huge, relatively speaking. We're adding a much bigger area here. And so the idea is that consumer surplus, if we use that as a measurement of overall welfare of consumers are much better under perfect competition. And we're also going to illustrate here later in the week about how there's associated welfare loss or deadweight loss associated with monopolies. So to get to that point where we want to talk about the average total cost curve, let's look at the graph once again, but we're going to add the ATC. So remember, it doesn't make a difference if you're the only firm in town or not. You still have to charge more than your average total cost to make a profit. So P is greater than ATC, you're profitable. P is less than ATC, you're losing money. And if P is equal to ATC, you're breaking even. So in theory, just because marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost doesn't mean you're earning a profit. Maybe you're the newspaper. In the newspaper, you're still maximizing your profits, but what you're actually doing is minimizing your losses because you're in an industry where the costs are going up and the demand curve is shifting inward. And that's not a good sign because what it ultimately means is it's a dying industry or a dying market, meaning that people aren't buying the product, so it doesn't make a difference if you have a monopoly or not. You're simply not going to make any profits. So to kind of add the average total cost curve here, what we see is profitable monopoly. So remember, how do we figure out what the quantity for monopoly is? Well, it's going to be where the MR and MC curves intersect, which is approximately right there. We trace that up to the demand curve to find the price. We move it over. So our profit here is whatever they're charging above ATC, which is this distance right here with my cursor moving up and down. Oops, click the wrong button. Right here, times the output. Now, what if they're losing money? This could very well be our newspaper. That their cost curve is above the demand curve at the profit maximizing quantity. And what that means is the best they can do is lose a little money right here per unit times the actual output, which means the total losses are going to be this long flat rectangle right here. This is an industry where clearly whatever they do, they're going to lose money. And so that could be obviously problematic. And I'm pointing this out because just because there's a monopoly that exists in a market doesn't mean they're making money hand over fist and they're basically rolling around in it. They could conceivably be breaking even. They could conceivably be making a small profit. They could even be losing money. A monopoly simply means what? That they're a price searcher and they have some control over the price, but they still have to deal with the demand curve for the product. And lastly, this will be our monopoly. The best they can do is break even, in which case, even though the graph's not perfect, where the average total cost curve happens to be the same as the price right there at the monopoly quantity. So that's all I have for today. What I'm going to do on Wednesday, I've got some really good examples. I'm going to use some current information regarding something called price discrimination. One of my favorite topics to actually talk about in the semester. I think it's really useful information. I think it's a great extension of the practical side of a lot of what we're talking about here in class. And I've got some data I want to show you and talk a little bit about why the numbers might be what the numbers are. So expect that on Wednesday. And then I'll talk a little bit about natural monopolies. And then we should have a shorter lecture for Friday to kind of pull it all together and move past this. So in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully everybody's doing great out there, and you will hear from me again on Wednesday.